Abigail stood knee-deep in a pool of white milk and jagged metal, the air thick with the smell of scorched insulation, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. On the floor of her barn, a single sheet of paper lay soaked in the freezing spill. A contract she'd never seen, bearing her own signature in a hand that wasn't hers. Through the splintered wood of the barn wall, she watched her oldest friend lean against his polished SUV, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper into a phone as he checked his watch like a man waiting for a timer to run out. A sudden, violent crack echoed from the darkness of the rafters, and the heavy iron wrench she had used for years slipped from the workbench as if pushed by an invisible hand. Abigail lunged for it, but her boots slid on the slick, white floor, sending her crashing toward the sharp edge of the ruptured cooling tank. Outside, the engine of the black SUV roared to life, its headlights cutting through the Vermont mist like the eyes of a predator. As the tail lights faded into the gray morning, Abigail realized the metal hadn't just failed, it had been cut, and the man she trusted to save her farm was already driving away with the deed to her life in his pocket. Abigail Thornton pulled the collar of her father's worn flannel shirt tighter against her throat, trying to trap the fading warmth of her own skin. The Vermont air arrived early and sharp this morning, carrying the scent of bruised grass and the heavy, sodden weight of a mist that refused to lift. It clung to the valley like a burial shroud, blurring the edges of the world until the silhouettes of the pine forest became nothing more than jagged, ghostly teeth against a leaden sky. She stepped off the porch, her rubber boots sinking into the mud with a rhythmic, sucking sound that felt like the earth trying to pull her down and keep her there. She walked toward the equipment shed, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch the flank of the old tractor. Under her fingertips, the metal didn't feel like the sturdy heart of a farm. It felt like a corpse. Flakes of rust, orange and brittle as autumn leaves, fell away at her touch, exposing the pitted, gray corrosion beneath. The farm breathed a silence that Abigail found deafening. There was no lowing of cattle, no rhythmic clatter of milk pails, only the wind whistling through the rotted slats of the barn, making the wooden gates scream on their rusted hinges. She stopped at a concrete trough, looking down into a crack where a pool of rainwater had gathered. It reflected the gray ceiling of the world back at her, a mirror of everything she was losing. Inside the barn, the air was colder, smelling of stale manure and the metallic tang of failing machinery. Abigail knelt before the milking unit, her knuckles white as she gripped a heavy wrench. The tool felt clumsy in her hands, her fingers stiff from a decade of mornings just like this one. But she forced the metal to bite into a stripped bolt. A harsh, screeching sound echoed off the rafters, a scream of protesting iron that made her teeth ache. From a hairline fracture in the rubber hose, a thin hiss of escaping air mocked her efforts. She glanced at the pressure gauge. The needle remained slumped at 0, dead and indifferent. She wiped a streak of grease across her forehead, the black smear mixing with the cold sweat of frustration. Her hands dangled over an old tobacco tin she used for spare parts, but her search yielded only bent nails and washers so thin they were transparent. The specific gasket she needed, the one that would hold the vacuum, the one that would let her harvest the morning's yield, wasn't there. It was never there. With a guttural sound of exhaustion, she flung the wrench against the concrete floor. The clang vibrated through the empty stalls, a lonely, desperate note that seemed to summarize the last 5 years of her life. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. Abigail stood, smoothing her shirt, as a heavy black SUV rolled into the yard, its polished chrome a vulgar intrusion against the weathered gray of the Thornton estate. Mark Sullivan climbed out, looking every bit the man who had escaped the mud. His coat was perfectly pressed, his collar stiff, and his shoes expensive leather that had never seen a shovel. shone with a hateful brilliance. He held a thick leather portfolio against his chest, like a shield. "Abigail," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. He didn't wait for a greeting before handing her a stack of papers. The sheets felt unnaturally smooth and cold, the headers stamped with bold red ink and the aggressive logos of collections agencies. She didn't need to read the numbers to feel their weight. Her eyes skipped over the tables, the mounting interest, the penalties that grew like a cancer in the margins. The debt was no longer a number. It was a physical presence, a shadow stretching from the bank in the city all the way to her front door. She felt Mark watching her, his silence heavy with an expectation she wasn't ready to meet. Her fingers crumpled the edge of the top sheet, leaving a damp, dark smudge where her thumb pressed into the paper. "I have a plan, Mark," she said, her voice coming out in small, white puffs of steam. She gestured toward the main hutch of the barn, her movements frantic, driven by a sudden surge of adrenaline. "The county fair. If I can get the champion ribbon for the heifer and the grant for sustainable dairies, it'll change the credit rating. The bank will have to listen. Just give me a week. Talk to them. Tell them I just need one more week." Mark rubbed his chin, his gaze drifting toward his shoes, now spotted with the very mud he'd spent half his life trying to outrun. He shifted his weight, his expression unreadable, a mask of professional pity that made Abigail's stomach turn. She waited for him to speak. Her jaw clenched so tight, the muscles in her neck throbbed. She wasn't asking for a miracle. She was asking for the time her family had earned over 3 generations of sweat and broken bones. "I'll see what I can do, Abby," he murmured, though his eyes remained fixed on a pile of rotted timber near the well. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp, digital intrusion. He excused himself with a curt nod and stepped away toward the old stone well to take the call, leaving his SUV idling, the door slightly ajar. Abigail started toward the house, but a glimpse of gold through the window of Mark's car caught her eye. She reached into the footwell, thinking he'd dropped his keys, but her hand found something else. It was a folder, heavy and embossed with a logo she recognized from the predatory flyers that had been appearing in mailboxes across the county. Green Valley Holdings. She pulled the document out, her breath hitching. The words, "Agreement of Sale," stared back at her. Beneath them, in a cold, legal font, was the description of her land, the east pasture, the woodlot, the house, and there, in the signature line for the seller, was the name Thornton, penned in a firm, decisive hand that wasn't hers. The world seemed to tilt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a dull, panicked thud that drowned out the sound of the wind. From around the corner of the barn, she heard Mark's laughter, a light, easy sound. He was talking about clearing the title and finalizing the transition. She shoved the papers back into the glove box just as his footsteps approached. She grabbed a nearby bucket of grain, her movements jerky and desperate, and began dumping it into a dry feeder. Her skin felt too tight for her body. When Mark appeared, his face was back to its neutral, helpful mask. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in her pallor. "Fine," she spat, not looking up. "Just the machinery. It's a struggle." She forced her hands to stay steady, focusing on the golden kernels of corn. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, a predatory heat. He whistled a low, tuneless melody, the sound of a man who had already moved on to the next deal, while Abigail felt the foundations of her reality crumbling into the Vermont silt. As Mark slipped behind the barn again to continue his hushed conversation, Abigail pressed her face against the rough, cold wood of the barn wall. Through a gap in the siding, she watched his shadow. He was pacing, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, mentioning dates and site inspections. He spoke the name Green Valley with a reverence that made her blood run cold. He wasn't her advocate. He was the undertaker. A sudden, violent roar from the milk room shattered her paralysis. A metallic screech, followed by a wet, explosive thump, sent a cloud of steam billowing out of the doorway. Abigail ran toward the sound, the air becoming thick with the smell of scorched insulation and hot, raw milk. The cooling tank, the heart of her operation, had finally surrendered. The lid had been blown clean off, and a jagged piece of steel was embedded in the ceiling joists. Milk was everywhere. It sprayed from a ruptured line in a white, frothy arc, coating the walls, the floor, and Abigail herself. She lunged for the breach, her hands slick and freezing as she tried to plug the hole with a wad of old burlap. The liquid was ice cold, soaking through her shirt, numbing her skin until it burned. She struggled to slide a heavy aluminum bin under the leak, her muscles screaming with the effort. Every gallon that hit the floor was $1 she didn't have. A minute closer to the end. She was on her knees in the white puddle, gasping for air, when Mark stepped into the room. He didn't offer a hand. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the gray morning light, looking down at her with a chilling, detached calm. "You see, Abby?" he said, his voice low and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. "It's a sign. The land is tired. You're tired. Green Valley. They're offering a way out. A clean break. No more rust, no more cold. Just a check and a new life." He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a fresh pen, holding it out toward her like a peace offering. Abigail looked at the pen, then up at the man she had called a friend since they were children. She stood up, the milk dripping from her hair, her eyes burning with a lucidity that seemed to startle him. She didn't take the pen. Instead, she swiped it out of his hand, flinging it into the dark recesses of the barn. "The farm isn't for sale, Mark," she said, her voice oracular and cold. "Not to them, not to you. I'm going to that fair. I'm going to find people who know what a handful of dirt is actually worth." She pointed toward the road, her arm as straight and unyielding as an iron bar. "Get off my land." Mark's face shifted then, the mask of the helpful friend slipping to reveal the jagged edges of a man who had already spent the commission in his head. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked to his SUV. The engine's roar, a final, defiant snarl as he sped away, leaving Abigail alone in the ruins of her dairy, the white milk swirling down the drain like a disappearing ghost. She didn't sleep. The night was a blur of grease, sweat, and the harsh glare of work lights. She spent the hours under the hood of the old transport van, her fingers dancing over the engine with a desperate, newfound precision. She scrubbed the heifer, Bella, until the cow's coat shone like polished copper, and she loaded the crates of cheese and bottled milk with a grim, silent resolve. She knew Mark was out there, somewhere in the dark, but she didn't care. She had the road, she had the truth, and for the first time in years, she had a reason to fight. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when the first of the black SUVs returned. They didn't come to the house this time. They parked across the end of the driveway, 3 of them, a wall of tinted glass and silent engines. Abigail climbed into the cab of her van, the engine coughing to life with a defiant rattle. She rolled forward until her bumper was inches from the lead vehicle. 2 men stepped out. They wore identical charcoal suits and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the bleak Vermont dawn. One of them didn't speak. He simply held a laminated document against her windshield. It was a notice of immediate seizure, a legal ambush. Abigail gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning the color of bone. The van's engine hissed, a plume of steam rising from the radiator like a warning. She didn't back down. She revved the engine, the vibration shaking the very frame of the vehicle, a clear signal that she would drive through them if she had to. Suddenly, Mark's truck appeared, skidding to a halt in the grass beside the road. He jumped out, waving his arms, playing the mediator again. He ran to Abigail's window, his face a distorted mask of feigned panic. "Abby, wait! Don't do this! They have the paperwork, but there's a loophole. The fair. If we get Bella to the auction, if we win the champion's purse, I can file an injunction. It's the only way." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "I got the transport locks fixed. Go. I'll hold them here. Just go." Abigail looked at him, searching for the lie. But the desperation in his voice felt real enough to be a tool she could use. She didn't thank him. She simply slammed the van into gear and lurched forward as the SUVs parted, the men in suits watching her pass with the indifferent gaze of vultures. She drove toward the fairgrounds, the weight of the heifer in the back shifting with every turn. She had spent her last cent on high-protein feed and coat oils, a final, frantic gamble. She pulled into a vet supply station near the outskirts of town, dumping a handful of crumpled singles and loose change on the counter for a bottle of vitamins. While she was inside, Mark, who had followed at a distance, slipped to the back of her van. He moved with a practiced, oily grace, pressing a lump of soft wax into the heavy padlock on the rear doors. He worked quickly, the metallic click of the mechanism muffled by the distant lowing of cattle from the fairgrounds. By the time Abigail returned, he was back in his truck, watching her through the rearview mirror with a smile that never reached his eyes. The exhaustion began to settle into her bones like lead. As they neared the fairgrounds, Mark pulled alongside and signaled for her to pull over. He climbed out, carrying a thermos. "You're shaking, Abby," he said, his voice dripping with a synthetic warmth. "Drink this. It's herbal, something my mother used to make for the nerves. You need to be sharp for the judges." She took the cup, the steam rising in the cool air. It had a strange, bitter undertone, something sharp and medicinal beneath the clover honey. She drank it anyway, the heat a temporary comfort against the damp chill of the van. Within minutes, the world began to lose its edges. The trees blurred into a single, dark green smear, and the hum of the engine sounded like it was coming from miles away. "Just rest your eyes for a second," Mark whispered, his hand on her shoulder, guiding her back into the driver's seat. "I'll watch the gate." The next thing Abigail knew was a violent jolt. Her head slammed against the side window, the crack of bone against glass, snapping her into a terrifying, fractured consciousness. The world was upside down. Rain was screaming against the windshield, a torrential downpour that turned the forest into a wall of gray water. The van was slanted in a ditch, the engine dead. The rear doors were wide open, swinging wildly in the wind. Bella was gone. Abigail stumbled out into the mud, the cold rain instantly soaking her to the bone. She screamed the cow's name, her voice thin and ragged against the roar of the storm. The forest was a maze of thorns and slick mud. She saw a flash of white, Bella's markings deep in the underbrush. She scrambled through the briars, the thorns tearing at her face and hands, but she didn't feel the pain. She saw a figure standing near a massive elm tree, a dark silhouette watching her. Mark. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He stood there in a high-end raincoat, a silent witness to her ruin. Bella had wandered toward the highway, her hooves clattering on the slick asphalt. Abigail burst through the tree line just as the blinding lights of a semi-truck rounded the bend. The air horn shrieked, a sound like a dying god. Abigail didn't think. She lunged, grabbing Bella's halter and throwing her entire weight backward. The truck roared past, the wind of its passage nearly knocking them both over, the smell of burnt rubber and wet pavement choking the air. She didn't let go. She led the trembling animal back toward the fairgrounds on foot. The two of them, a pair of ghosts, walking the white line of the highway. When she finally reached the lights of the fair, she looked like a creature crawled out of the earth. Her clothes were shredded, her face a map of bloody scratches, her boots caked in thick, gray clay. Mark was there, waiting by the registration tent. He rushed forward, draping a dry jacket over her shoulders, his face a masterpiece of performed relief. "Thank God," he breathed, reaching for her registration folder. "I'll take these. You get her to the wash rack. I'll handle the officials." Abigail was too tired to argue. She watched him walk away toward the main stage, his stride confident and clean. She began to scrub Bella, the brush moving in a rhythmic, mechanical trance, until a hand touched her shoulder. It was Mr. Holt, a man who had been her father's lawyer and a fixture of the county for 60 years. He looked older than she remembered, his eyes magnified behind thick lenses. He didn't say hello. He simply handed her a piece of paper, a fresh printout from the county recorder's office. "Abigail," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I saw the filing this morning. I thought you had moved to the city. I thought you had given up." She looked at the document. It was a title transfer. Her name was at the bottom, but the handwriting was wrong. It was too perfect, too steady. It was a forgery, signed a week ago, under the guise of a debt consolidation report. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Mark hadn't been trying to save the farm. He had been the one who sold it. Every move, every accident, the drugged tea, the loose lock. It was all a theater to keep her busy while the ink dried on the theft of her life. She looked toward the main stage. Mark was already there, standing under the bright lights, a microphone in his hand. The crowd of farmers, her neighbors, stood in a silent semicircle, their faces weary and expectant. "Friends," Mark's voice boomed through the speakers, "we all know the struggle. We all know the Thornton farm has been a pillar. But the time for sentiment is over. I am proud to announce that Green Valley Holdings will be taking over the management of these lands, bringing the investment and technology we so desperately need." Abigail didn't wait to hear the rest. She shoved past the security guards, her boots heavy with the mud of the forest. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an omen. She reached the stage and, with a single, violent motion, tore down the heavy velvet curtain that blocked the rear access. The fabric fell in a heap of dust and red shadow. She stepped into the light, her eyes fixed on Mark. He stopped mid-sentence, the microphone letting out a piercing, feedback squeal. "You forgot one thing, Mark," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall without the need for amplification. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the copies Holt had given her. She didn't speak. She simply threw them. They fluttered through the air like white birds, landing among the feet of the farmers in the front row. "Look at the dates," she shouted. "Look at the signatures. He didn't save us. He sold us before the first frost even hit." The room erupted. The murmur of the crowd turned into a low, dangerous growl. Two security guards moved toward her, but they were blocked by a wall of flannel and denim. Old Miller and the Dawson boys stepped forward, their faces set in the grim lines of men who knew when they were being cheated. Mark's face turned a violent, bruised purple. He gripped the microphone until his knuckles turned white. "She's delusional," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Look at her. She's a broken woman clinging to a dead world. Green Valley is the future. You're all going to starve in the mud without them." He turned on Abigail, his eyes wide and wet with a sudden, frantic hatred. You think this matters? The papers are filed. The land is gone. You're nothing but a squatter in a house that doesn't belong to you. Abigail didn't flinch. She walked to the center of the stage and took the spare microphone from the podium. He's right about one thing, she said, her voice steady now, a cold iron bell. He has the papers. He has the money. He has the lawyers. She looked out at the crowd, at the men and women she had known her entire life. But he doesn't have the dirt. And he doesn't have us. She turned to Mark, her gaze so fierce he actually recoiled. I know about the 7-figure kickback, Mark. I saw the bank codes in your car. I know what your soul cost. The crowd surged then. A heavy, overripe apple caught Mark in the shoulder, spraying pulp across his expensive suit. Then a cup of coffee. Then the roar of 100 voices, all of them screaming the word, traitor. Mark lost it. He lunged at Abigail, his hands reaching for her throat. She didn't move, but the impact sent her reeling backward. She hit the stage floor hard, the wood splinters biting into her palms. The sound of her body hitting the boards was the final spark. The farmers leapt the barricades, a sea of righteous fury that swept over the stage. In the chaos, the representative from Green Valley tried to slip away, his leather briefcase clutched to his chest. Abigail scrambled to her feet, ignoring the fire in her back, and blocked the exit. Look at them, she whispered to the man in the gray suit. Look at the people you're trying to erase. The man didn't look. He stared at his own polished shoes, his hands trembling. The police arrived in a blur of blue and red, their sirens drowning out the dying music of the fair. They led Mark away in handcuffs, his face pressed against the window of the cruiser, a frantic, trapped animal. Abigail stood in the center of the empty hall long after the crowds had been cleared. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from the moon through the high, dusty windows. She felt the silence again, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of death, it was the silence of a clean slate. She drove back to the farm in the dark. At the gate, she saw the silhouettes of 10 trucks. Her neighbors were waiting. They didn't say much. They just started unloading, bales of hay, drums of diesel, bags of seed. Cooperative, Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco into the mud. If they want one of us, they have to take all of us. We're doubling the acreage. We're pooling the milk. Abigail looked at the house, the old Thornton place. A state official was there, pinning a notice to the door. The land was still in legal limbo. The fight was just beginning, and the banks would be coming with their red pens and their cold hearts. But as she walked up the steps, she didn't look at the notice. She looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, a thin, sharp line of gold cutting through the Vermont mist. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the forged contract, the paper that had nearly ended her. She walked to a rusted iron barrel in the yard and dropped a match inside. The paper curled, the name Green Valley turning to gray ash that the wind caught and carried away toward the mountains. She wasn't just a Thornton anymore. She was the line in the sand. And as she watched the last of the black SUVs retreat down the county road, Abigail Thornton put her hands in the dirt, felt the cold, stubborn life of it. And finally, for the first time in years, she breathed.